Good evening. My name is Noam, and I'm the research manager at Moreshet, the Mordechai Anielewicz International Center for Holocaust Documentation, Research, and Education. We're just 5 days away from International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and today we are hosting this Zoom event in cooperation with the WHISC, Women in the Holocaust International Studies Center. Before we begin, we wish to echo the call, the hope, and the demand for the return of all Israeli citizens who have been taken hostage by the Hamas. Our topic today is both important and potentially triggering: sex, sexuality, and sexual abuse in wartime. There are 3 speakers scheduled. Each will present 15 to 20 minutes, followed by approximately 30 minutes for discussion and questions. We would appreciate if you could mute yourself during the presentation. Professor Zamir is the co-founder and academic director of WHISC. Professor Zamir, professor of history and humanities at David Yellin Academic College of Education, has authored numerous articles in English on the Holocaust and gender, and has published 9 books on this theme. One of her books was published in English by Brill Publishing. Professor Zamir will be moderating this Zoom event. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Noah. And good evening, good morning, whatever it is, according to your time. I'm very honored and excited to open this international panel of WHISC, Women in the Holocaust International Studies Center, on sex, sexuality, and sexual abuse in war times. This event opens WHISC's second year of activities and will hopefully start a tradition of Zoom meetings focusing on women in the Holocaust from different aspects every other month. Of course, you will be informed before. As you may all know, WHISC is the only comprehensive international study center devoted to women and the Holocaust. Our vision is to widen the interdisciplinary, intersectional, and multi-cultural research by focusing on the unique fate of women during the Holocaust. This covers women who were victims, victimizers, survivors, rescuers, resistors, or bystanders, Jews and non-Jews. We heartily invite you to look at our website and be a part of our activities. Those of you who would like to present in this forum, please contact us. I wish us all a very interesting event, a challenging evening. Thank you all for being with us. In this panel, we have 3 outstanding scholars, and after the 3 presentations, we will have a discussion. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Professor Carol Rittner. Professor Carol Rittner is the honorary president of WHISC, and as I used to say, she's the high priestess of the whole research about women in the Holocaust. She was one of the pioneers in the field. Dr. Carol Rittner, RMS, is a distinguished professor of Holocaust and gender and emerita at Stockton University, New Jersey, USA. She is the author and editor of numerous books and essays, various scholars, educational journals, and Holocaust, and other genocides of the 20th and 21st century. Professor Rittner had published many books. I would like just to mention 3 or 4, the last ones. Advancing Holocaust Studies 21, The Memory of Goodness, Eva Fleischner's and her Contributions to Holocaust Studies 2022, and Holocaust Education Today on 2023. Professor Rittner has been lecturing widely in the USA, as well in Australia, Cambodia, Canada, Israel, Ireland, England, Sweden, Palestine, France, and South Africa. Professor Rittner will talk today about sexual violence during the Holocaust. Dr. Rittner, we are all yours.
Thank you very much, Lily, and thank you to everyone for zooming into our seminar today. I'm speaking to you from the state of Pennsylvania in the United States of America. Because I'm the honorary president of WHISC, Women in the Holocaust International Study Center, which was established about 2 years ago under the very capable leadership of Dr. Lily Zamir and Mr. Jakob Amsher, at the Mordechai Anielewicz Memorial Givat Haviva, Israel, and because WHISC is the organizer and sponsor of our seminar today, I want to say a few words about it. WHISC is an interdisciplinary study center, as Lily has already said, and it focuses on the fate of women during the Nazi era, World War II, and the Holocaust. It is intended to be a place where scholars and educators at all levels, secondary, post-secondary, graduate, and postgraduate, can research and study the fate of women during those terrible years. It does not mean that our study center does not want to be in solidarity with women who have suffered in other genocides of the 20th and 21st centuries, or that we are closing our ears and eyes, our hearts, to the Jewish and non-Jewish women who were sexually violated, murdered, or taken hostage by Hamas terrorists on October 7th, 2023. For sure, we want to be, and we are, in solidarity with these women and girls, with the women and girls still held hostage by Hamas terrorists in Gaza. But as you can imagine, WHISC cannot do everything, even though our hearts may feel everything. Our International Study Center on Women in the Holocaust wants to enable and encourage scholars and educators to research, discuss, write, and teach about issues and questions concerning women during those terrible years, including issues and questions that are difficult, sensitive, even embarrassing. And no issue is more difficult, sensitive, even embarrassing for some people to confront and discuss than sexual violence during the Holocaust. Given the profound significance of the Holocaust in the present and for the future of humanity, an interdisciplinary, gender-focused, and historical understanding and accuracy about the role and fate of women in the Holocaust is vital, not just as an issue in the past, but for the sake of the future. That's why we do what we do, for the sake of the future. For many years, for too many years, Holocaust scholars generalized from the male perspective about the role of perpetrators, about the victimization of Jews and non-Jews, and about the experience of resistors, rescuers, and bystanders during the Holocaust. The voices and experiences of women were basically overlooked, even silenced. Zoe Waxman, an historian and feminist scholar at Royal Holloway College, University of London, believes that even these many years after the Holocaust, there is still significant resistance against the study of sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust. Waxman insists that historiography of the Holocaust still offers a relatively male narrative. Her 2017 book, Women in the Holocaust, A Feminist History, sets out to reveal the gendered hierarchies that existed in all forms of persecution during the Holocaust. There's still a great deal of research about women during the Holocaust that remains to be done, hence our seminar today. The Holocaust era began in January 1933 when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. It ended in May 1945 when the Allied powers defeated Nazi Germany. There's no need for me to discuss the Holocaust in detail. We know what it was. the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews by the Nazi German regime and its allies and collaborators. But I do want to say a few words about sexual violence during the Holocaust. Sexual violence seems to be a particularly effective form of dehumanization because sexual activities and sexual organs are so closely associated with individual and group honor. All forms of sexual violence are destructive of the victim, but perhaps none is more destructive and devastating than rape, an atrocity that can be inflicted on boys and men as well as on women and girls. Although my comments today are focused on women and girls and what they suffered, but sexual violence includes much more than rape, horrible as it is. Sexual violence encompasses rape, but also sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, and any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity, which may, depending on the circumstances, include situations of indecent assault, inappropriate medical examinations, and strip searches. For a very long time, female survivors did not speak about sexual violence during the Holocaust. Why? Because some people were silenced by cultural taboos. Others were silenced by shame, ashamed of having been violated in such a humiliating and demeaning manner. But times and circumstances have changed. Silence has been broken. Teaching and learning about sexual violence during the Holocaust is taking place in colleges and universities and in other venues as well. But it is work that needs to be expanded, deepened, and extended. Eva Fogelman, an American psychologist who has written extensively about the Holocaust, points out that of the 52,000 interviews conducted by the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation, more than 48,000 are with Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. These interviews include more than 1,000 testimonies, mostly from women, that reference rape and sexual molestation. Virtually all women rounded up and deported into camps were sexually abused. How so, you might ask? By being forced to stand naked in front of men, by having their vaginas poked, prodded, and smeared with caustic disinfectant, and by being forced into prostitution in bordellos or in private homes of soldiers or guards. Sometimes soldiers in the Einsatzgruppen who shot Jews into pits in the East first raped young women, then murdered them. Wendy Lauer's book, The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed, refers to that. Both inside and outside the concentration and death camps, women were forced to provide sex for food, which was meager at best, but life-sustaining nonetheless. Occasionally, a Nazi-appointed Jewish governing council in a ghetto, the Judenrat, had to furnish the Nazis with pretty young women to prevent, temporarily of course, the Jewish population's deportation. Their sex was a means of survival. All genocides are gendered events. We need to recognize the impact of gender on genocide, or we cannot grasp the significance of the exterminatory effort. Gender is both a marker of biological sex and a set of cultural practices and beliefs aimed at organizing relations of power between the sexes. It is an accepted, useful, and relevant category for understanding the violence of genocide. Of course, Jewish men and women were killed during the Holocaust, and they were killed because they were Jewish. But only Jewish women were killed because they also could give birth to Jewish children. The American sociologist Helen Fine says that gender and sex are related to population and group survival through socialization, marriage, and family patterns and reproduction. Nazi ideology viewed women, all women, Jewish and Gentile women alike, as agents of fertility. Reproduction serves to continue the group, genocide to destroy it. Thus, perpetrators of genocide must either annul reproduction within the group or appropriate the progeny in order to destroy the group in the long run. As you can imagine, this Nazi ideology regarding women was a double whammy when it came to Jewish women. They were Jewish and they were agents of Jewish fertility. Jewish women were targets because they were Jewish and because they were women. Annihilate Jewish women and you thwart the rise of future generations of Jews. Some people think only Germans, for example, members of the Wehrmacht, the SS, or members of the German auxiliary police, were perpetrators of rape and other forms of sexual violence against Jewish women and girls, even against men. But that's not true. Jewish women, men, and children were vulnerable to rape and other forms of sexual violence, not only by the Germans, but also by a variety of collaborators and local people in German-occupied European countries. Doris Bergen, the Canadian Holocaust historian, draws our attention to numerous instances of sexual violence during the Holocaust. She writes, for example, about a Jewish girl who was hidden with a Christian family, in Poland in this case, but it might have been elsewhere. The people saved her life at great risk to themselves. At the same time, male members of the family abused her sexually. Another example. In the summer of 1944, as German soldiers forced Hungarian Jews into transports to Auschwitz, they conducted a crude vaginal search on a teenage girl, who later described the violation in a memoir she wrote. In another memoir by a Polish Jewish woman, she recounts the shame of forced nakedness before leering Nazi guards and officials upon her arrival at Auschwitz. A final example that Bergen writes about is about a man who tells about a Jewish woman he knows who ended up in a camp brothel. After the war, she concealed that part of her past. Yes, there was sexual abuse of hidden children and adults, dismemberment, assaults, and threats of assaults on sexual organs, rape, and sexual slavery. All appear, sometimes starkly, more often obscured and disguised, in memoirs and testimony. Bergen draws our attention to these examples, but there are others as well, and perhaps some of our other panelists will speak about them. Even Jewish women who managed to escape from the ghettos and camps and find a hiding place, or who joined up with a partisan group in the forests, did not always find safety. They were not necessarily safe with Jewish men. In partisan groups, women who were alone feared Jewish men who might rape them. In order to avoid this fate, a woman might attach herself to a particular man who would then protect her. The relationship with the protector sometimes began with the man who initially raped her. The question for those of us who study and teach about the Holocaust is, what should we do with such information? Should we overlook it, refuse to discuss it because it seems inappropriate, disturbing, or offensive? Or should we confront it and try to teach our students about it? Of course, I come down on the side of confronting and trying to teach about sexual violence during the Nazi era, World War II, and the Holocaust. Doing so inevitably means we must confront the dark side of humanity. Such teaching and study is emotionally and intellectually demanding. In my experience about teaching about sexual violence during the Holocaust is done for two primary reasons. First, because we want our students to know what happened and to understand that sexual violence is destructive of human dignity. Sexual violence compounded the mayhem, the suffering, murder, and death inflicted on victims during the Holocaust by violating the most personal, intimate, and vulnerable parts of a person's embodied life and spirit. It should not be forgotten. Second, we teach about it because we want our students to develop sensitivity and compassion toward victims of sexual violence during the Holocaust, and a determination to hold perpetrators of sexual violence during the Holocaust, if they're still living, as well as during subsequent genocides of the 20th and 21st centuries, accountable for dehumanizing behavior. We need to keep in mind, however, that during the Holocaust, sexual violence was only one of the many ways women were made to suffer. So while it is important to focus on this kind of violence, we should not privilege it so much that it obscures other forms of violence and suffering women endured during the Holocaust. Women also starved to death and died of disease. They were killed and wounded, enslaved, forcibly displaced, separated, imprisoned, and tortured to death. It is important to teach about sexual violence in this wider context of the suffering of women during the Holocaust. I think the best teaching and learning about sexual violence during the Nazi era, World War II, and the Holocaust should encourage students to learn the facts about what women and girls suffered, and should give students the analytical and practical skills they need to deal with such questions, such as, what is the place of sex in the Holocaust? What and whom do dominant narratives silence, and why? Enabling students to understand what gender is and how it impacts one's understanding of the Nazi era and the Holocaust, encouraging them to ask gender-related questions about the victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and rescuers during the Holocaust, helping them to analyze and understand how the experiences of men and women were similar in some ways and different in other ways, keeping in front of them Myrna Goldenberg's insight that men and women may have suffered the same hell, but they suffered different horrors during the Holocaust, are some of the analytical and practical skills students need as they wrestle with what happened and to whom during the Holocaust. At the same time that we are trying to encourage our students to develop and use these analytical and practical skills, we need to emphasize the sacredness of every human being, gay and straight, transgender and bisexual, male and female. Perhaps we would have been better able to prevent the sexual violence inflicted on women and girls by genocidaires in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Congo in the 1990s if we had not waited 50 or 60 years after the Nazi era, World War II, and the Holocaust to learn about and pay attention to the sexual violence suffered by Jewish and non-Jewish women during the Holocaust in the ghettos and concentration camps, in the forests, cities, towns, and villages where Jews were hiding from the Nazis and their collaborators during the Holocaust. Or if we had not waited so long to pay attention to the sexual violence women suffered as World War II was coming to an end, and Allied soldiers, the Soviets, but also the French, American, and British soldiers as well, raped hundreds of thousands of women as they fought their way to victory across Nazi Germany. Perhaps if we had held the rapists accountable, the Nazi ones as well as the Allied ones, if we had punished them at the time of the Nazi war crime trials after World War II, well, you can complete that sentence. Yes, Jewish women suffered sexual violence during the Holocaust, but so also did non-Jewish women. Yes, many, many Jewish and non-Jewish women did not speak openly about the sexual violence they suffered until years after the end of the Nazi era, World War II, and the Holocaust. Most of them have since died. Now it's up to us to be their voice and to tell their stories.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Rittner. Wow, one needs to breathe after your lecture. And of course, questions to Dr. Rittner or comments will be at the end of the other presentations. Now I'm honored to invite another dear member from WHISC, Dr. Batya Brutin. Dr. Brutin is in the steering committee of WHISC. She is an art historian, a researcher, and an educator of art during and after the Holocaust. Dr. Brutin was the head of Holocaust studies in Beit Berl Academic College between the years 2000 and 2018, which means more than 18 years. She was the head of Holocaust studies. And she is also very active in teaching the Holocaust in Yad Vashem. Dr. Brutin received the Yad Vashem Award for Lifetime Achievement in the field of Holocaust education in 2018. Since 2022, Dr. Brutin is, as I said, a member in WHISC Academic Steering Committee. She has published several books and articles, and also was the curated art of exhibitions dealing with these topics of Holocaust and Holocaust memory. Dr. Brutin is going to talk about Violated, Women During the Holocaust in Visual Arts. Dr. Brutin, please.
Thank you, Lily. Let me share. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Lily. The themes that surface rapidly in women's Holocaust visual art are the subject of sexual humiliation, sexual abuse, sexual assault, and sexual violence directed against women during the Holocaust by the Nazis and their collaborators. Works of art created during and right after the Holocaust by Holocaust women victims are an authentic documentary expression of the events of that area. They commemorate and reflect upon this violence and serve to inform viewers about a relevantly unfamiliar part of history. The first subject I will address to is the negation of femininity and identity by shaving women's hair and by dressing them in striped prisoner uniform. Many women survivors testified that shaving...
But if you just could make the presentation on full screen.
It is full screen.
And no, not yet.
Now?
No.
Yeah.
Yes?
No, not yet. אוקיי. יש את הכוסית למטה, ברגע שאת תשתפי את המסך, יש את ה...
זה גדול עכשיו.
Great. Yeah, now it's good.
So it's okay? Okay, as I said, the first subject will be, I will address to, is the negation of femininity and identity by shaving women's hair and by dressing them in striped prisoner uniform. Survivors testified that the shaving of their hair in the camps was not only humiliating to them as human beings, but also an unbearable negation of their femininity. Holocaust survivor Batsheva Dagan describes in a section of her poem her own experience of shaving her hair when she arrived at Getting a number instead of a name, that was a source of deep, painful shame. But what was harder still to bear was when they shaved off all my hair. My head was covered in stubbly thorn. I was almost bald, completely shorn. My hair, my crown, my femininity, my hair, my own, that belongs to me. Holocaust survivor Zofia Rosenstrahl, later known as Nomi Yudkovsky from Kibbutz Lochamei HaGetaot, drew 20 drawings right after her liberation from Auschwitz. In the drawing, Tsugangi, new inmates, she portrayed a row of young, attractive, undressed Jewish women standing in line and waiting for the shaving of their bodies and heads in the Auschwitz sauna before going into the shower scene in the background. In the center, the artist shows a young girl sitting on a stool holding her shoes while a woman prisoner dressed in the prisoner's uniform, apron, and a headscarf is cutting her hair. On the right, a Nazi soldier holding a whip and supervises the process. The artist depicted the beautiful hair, the young girl's head, to emphasize the humiliation, the insult, and the delusion of a personal identity. Ella Lieberman-Schieber shows in her graphic style drawing the sauna couple brutally cut hair of a woman in the center, while the woman on the right is already shaved and the woman on the left is next. On the right bottom, the artist depicted a sack full of hair and she wrote mattress industry, Berlin. Many women camp survivors refer to the moment when they were compelled to wear the striped prisoner uniform and lost their feminine uniqueness. As Agnes Bartha, a Jewish Hungarian Ravensbrück concentration camp survivor remembered, and I quote, "They took away our clothes and everything we had with us and gave us other people's clothes, little summer dresses, even though it was already very cold, and any clothes at all. When we looked at each other, we had to laugh. We couldn't help but laugh, shocked at how we looked." End of quote. Esther Luria, Esther Luria depicted a woman prisoner with oversized, worn-out men's striped prisoner uniform. Clothing is important to femininity feeling, and therefore the loss of femininity wearing these clothes affected very much the women in the camp. When Holocaust survivor Halina Olomotsky was a prisoner in Auschwitz-Birkenau, she also drew the women in Birkenau in 1945 while still in the camp. Olomotsky depicted women prisoners in striped uniform, humiliated and oppressed. They look emaciated, dressed in worn-out prisoner garments, and full of despair. In their attitude towards the Jews, the Nazis used violent terms such as extermination, massacre, special treatment, and more. the Jewish body in general was desired for them as an available cheap labor force, and the bodies of the women even more strongly as an object of medical experiments and sexual violence. That brings us to the second subject of depicting sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust. It includes a continuum of sexual abuse, such as physical sexual humiliation, sexual slavery, sex as means of survival, and rape, etc. Many women survivors testified that a forced abstraction in public was disgraceful for them. Ella Lieberman Shiver, portrayed the humiliation of women in Get Undressed, which depicts one of the stages of the dehumanization process at the entrance to Auschwitz. At the front of the drawing, an SS woman is wildly tearing off the blouse of a young woman who is trying in vain to hide her nakedness. Behind her at the center is another bent body of a topless woman. She too is trying ineffectively to cover her nakedness from the foreign eyes scrutinizing her body. A comparable depiction of humiliation appears in the drawing by Esther Luria. She shows the arrived woman to the camp, showering naked, supervised by SS men who appears in the background. Edith Van Kies portrayed a real incident that happened in Ravensbrück concentration camp in northern Germany, exclusively for women. Agnes Bartha, fellow inmates, testified, and here is the description and the verbal description, and I quote, "One of us, Hungarians, Zofie, had diarrhea and wanted to wash herself. Two SS women noticed it. They opened the window in the middle of winter and poured cold water on her. Afterwards, she became very confused and came back to the revier." Infirmary. Another two depictions from Auschwitz showing intentionally sexual humiliation. Yudkowsky shows the women being forced to bow down on all four, naked, while a Nazi commander examines their bodies, decides who will live and who will die, while kicking one of the prisoners with his rough boot. And Regina Leichter-Liron presented one of the punishment in Auschwitz. The women prisoners had to lean their upper bodies on tables with their dresses rolled up, while SS men whipped their exposed buttocks. This punishment takes place in public for all to see. The impression imparted here is that the perpetrators derive sexual sadistic pleasure from executing this punishment. I will conclude with a depiction by Holocaust survivor Ze'ev Porat, who was a prisoner in Janowska concentration camp, where the Nazi assigned him to work as a draftsman. During working on his tasks, he could see what was happening in the camp from the window of the workshop. In his drawing, Torches, he described how the Nazi undressed, tortured, and killed the Jewish women. Poat depicted the camp square where the naked Jewish women were gathered in groups with an armed Nazi guard guarding them. In front of these women, a group of murdered naked women is lying on the ground. In the foreground on the right, the artist shows a scene of torture. A naked woman is tied to a stack, and a Nazi guard is kicking her head and torturing her with his whip. This is an authentic description of the abuse and murder of Jewish women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brutin. The pictures that you shared with us were really, really enlightening and shocking at the same time. No doubt that one picture is worth so many, many words. Thank you very much, Dr. Brutin. Our last speaker for today's panel, last but not least, is Dr. Beverley Chalmers. She is a professor, emerita professor from Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Dr. Chalmers' research examines women and children's sexual abuse and lives during the Holocaust, and not only Holocaust. She dealt also with abused women and children in South Africa and in the former Soviet Union. Very surprisingly, Dr. Chalmers has 2 doctoral degrees, one in humanities, a PhD. She's a doctor of philosophy in psychology, and the other is in medicine. So she's really a multidisciplinary researcher. She has over 300 academic publications, and her name is including in 11 books and 58 book chapters. Her last books are Birth, Sex and Abuse, Women's Voice Under the Nazi Rule from 2015, Betrayed, Child Sex Abuse in the Holocaust 2020, and Child Sex Abuse, Power, Profit, and Prevention 2022. She has received over 20 book awards, and she's also a very distinguished member in WHISC. Bev is going to talk today about sexual villainy in the Holocaust. Bev, we are all yours.
Thank you. If I can share my screen, please. We want this one. Yeah. Let's open it. Okay. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate being part of WHISC's presentation today. It's a wonderful organization. I will today be talking about information based on 2 of my books, Birth, Sex and Abuse, Women's Voices Under Nazi Rule, and Betrayed, Child Sex Abuse in the Holocaust. I will start with the first book. The title is really Sexual Villainy in the Holocaust, and normally under the Nazi rule, the Jewish people were regarded as sexual villains. Nazi ideology very much presented Jews as seducers, adulterers, rapists of German women. They also presented them as the Jews have always been race defilers, for example. All the other pictures depicted Jews as seducing young German women. Even in the children's storybooks at the time, this image of the Jew was created. This is a book called Trust No Fox on His Green Heath and No Jew in His. Let me just get rid of this image of the side here. It's interfering. Sorry. In this little book for children, it says, what a creature is the Jew. Not even his own women he likes. To share himself a German wife, he thinks just cute. And another children's book, better known, The Poisonous Mushroom. Here he talks about the experience of Hans and Elsa with a strange man. Here, kids, I have some candy for you, but you both have to come with me. Or also from The Poisonous Mushroom, Inge's visit to a Jewish doctor. Two criminal eyes flashed behind the glasses and the fat lips grinned. Again, the same image of the Jewish predator. Of course, we know of Rassenschande, racial shame, which was very much a science, as they called it, created by the Nazis, depicting that if one had mixed marriage, mixed sex, you would develop mixed offspring, which were unpleasant looking, as depicted very much by the Jewish image that was created, rather than the pure racial Aryan image that was desired by the Nazis. But in reality, the real sexual villain of the Nazi era was not the Jew, it was the Nazis. And this talk will show how sexual cruelty occurred in villages, in towns, in ghettos, in prisons, in concentration camps. It targeted men and women, children, and groups. For example, homosexuals we know something about. We know less about Roma and Sinti, and we know even less about how it was targeted or directed towards disabled people or people of other alternate genders. We also know that sexual abuse was perpetrated by both men and women in the Nazi era and by the Germans and Nazis. But at the same time, let's look first at German sexuality. The Nazi regime decried so-called degenerate sexuality, and they promoted healthy sexuality. So much so that some of the research from the time, 1938, suggests that fewer than 5% of women, German women, were virgins at marriage. Seems to be a very low percentage. They also celebrated beauty and sexuality. On the top left, one sees a photography album created during the Nazi era of beautiful bodies depicted as wonderful. And on the right of these athletic camps and training that was regarded as ideal. And on the bottom three photos, you see paintings by Nazi artists of the time depicting beautiful German women and being sexual and titillating in their own way. They also encouraged joyful sexuality. One of the parades that was held in the Night of the Amazons, there were members of the League of German Girls who were paraded naked, apart from some cardboard helmets, the odd sash, on horseback, before an audience of tens of thousands. Prostitution was also controlled by the Nazi state. They actually developed a network of state-controlled brothels, and all except Jews and pure, so-called pure Aryan Germans could be forced into prostitution. Usually it was prisoners. The aims of these brothels were to satisfy German soldiers' needs, and this is something that happens in militaries all over the world. You can't take thousands of men from their family situations and expect them not to have sexual needs. It was also aimed to provide an incentive for higher productivity. One could then visit a brothel. Another intention was to avoid contamination of soldiers with sexually transmitted infections by monitoring such brothels and keeping control of the sexual problems that would emerge in such brothels. And some people have suggested that such brothels allowed for a sexual outlet for men who were constantly exposed to nudity, for example, as we've seen in the camps. This happens to be a brothel in the Paris area, and such brothels flourished under the Nazi patronage. Prostitution occurred in camps. There were a system of brothels throughout many of the camps, the major camps, and prisoners were volunteered for these. They did not normally volunteer themselves, but they were chosen. They were provided or offered 6 months to be there, better conditions, after which they could have their freedom, better conditions, and then freedom. Often they attracted or were picked, those who were picked were what were called asocials, who might have been prostitutes in their earlier lives. Women in these brothels had 15 minutes for each client. They could serve 80 to 40 men in a session, in an evening or an afternoon. Bells signaled when the session would start and end. There were peepholes in the doors so that the guards could watch and make sure what was happening. The women were paid a week's work, what was equivalent of a week's work, and infections in the women or pregnancy meant their death. And these brothels were usually restricted to German soldiers, German prisoners or foreign prisoners. But at the same time, outside of the camp situation, roundups occurred in ghettos, in towns, and in villages, and internal searches were done because it was suspected that Jewish women would hide their valuables in their vagina or in their mouths, and they were obviously inspected. They were beaten, the babies were hit against the walls, and women were raped. Body searches occurred. One woman writes, "I had seen women completely naked with their legs spread in a knee bent position, their upper body bent all the way down. They stood motionless with everything exposed, their faces to the wall, and the guards did the examining." In the villages, the Einsatzgruppen at the start of the invasion of Russia collected villages. Pregnant women were eviscerated. Babies were used as target practice. Children and women were also raped. Rape of Jewish women occurred almost everywhere, in hiding, in prisons, in ghettos, in camps, in public and in private, by the Wehrmacht, by the guards, by the SS, by non-Germans, by civilians, even by fellow prisoners. Their rape occurred in formal institutions such as brothels and in informal settings such as when their homes were looted. They were occasionally raped by Jewish men and their collaborators, and by people of all ages and in all countries. Some women testified about their own rape, some told about others, some survived and remained silent, but most of the women who were raped were also killed to prevent them from speaking out about Germans who might have broken the Rassenschande laws. In prisons, for example, we know that women were beaten while naked, they were tortured, they had their breasts mutilated, and Klaus Barbie in particular was known for having trained his dogs to mount women. In camps, the Nazis subjected the Jews to sexual humiliation, and this we've seen now in Batya's speech, his talk particularly, about bodily hair being shaved, their names replaced with numbers, they had to be identified by badges, which said what kind of category of prisoner they were, separated from their families, internal organs searched, repeated selections, usually while they were nude, minimal toileting facilities. They were overworked, beaten, and starved. Sex occurred in the camps too. This particular picture of the Auschwitz latrines is a place where this might well have did happen. Romance sometimes happened, but not often. More often, the latrines were used as a place of sexual exchange. When male workers came into the women's camps to fix some equipment or whatever, some of the women would offer themselves for a piece of bread or a shoelace or whatever might have helped them to survive for another day. And of course, there were rapes at the same time in these camps. Some groups were particularly targeted, such as the homosexuals. They were tortured horribly, and one of the treatments that was offered to homosexuals was that were forced to use prostitutes to so-called cure them of their homosexuality. Sexual brutality is also well documented in camps. Ivan Demjanjuk in Treblinka, for example, was known to have stabbed women's thighs before they entered the gas chambers, and he was known for raping women. SS officer Tauber in Auschwitz used to select women for the gas chambers based on drooping breasts. If their breasts drooped, they went to the gas. Irma Griese, the so-called bitch of Belsen, was in Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, and she was in charge of over 30,000 Jewish female prisoners. And she was known for savaging of prisoners by trained half-starved dogs. She had fascination with breast surgery. She had a plaited whip which used to take and whip the women in the camps. And when they became infected and had to go to the Riviera, the infirmary, to have this cleaned in whatever way it could be, she would insist on being present and was reported as having experienced orgasmic sensations while doing so. She became excited by it. She's known for her sexual excesses and selecting prisoners for the gas chambers and arbitrary shootings of prisoners. Ilse Koch, another one called the Witch of Buchenwald. She was the wife of the commandant of Buchenwald. She reveled in torture and obscenity, corruption and cruelty. She was infamous for her souvenirs, particularly tattoos taken from murdered inmates, and had a reputation for debauchery with camp guards. In some cases, sexual arousal through brutality. This was an illustration in Flossenburg, where the camp commander became sexually aroused when he watched homosexuals being beaten. And we saw that same image of the women being beaten by being stretched across a table. This happens to be an illustration from Flossenburg, which was primarily a camp that contained homosexual prisoners. The second part that I'll talk about is child sex abuse, and I base this on my other book, Betrayed, Child Sex Abuse in the Holocaust, where I talk about 160 cases of child sex abuse that I came across in my research, with the average age of the children being sexually abused being the age of 11. Sources of information about child sex abuse are more scarce. Records of hidden children were not kept. They were too unimportant to be recorded by the Germans, and the children were too young to record their own stories. It was also too dangerous to do so. There are a number of children's diaries that survived, but very few testimonies actually depict child sex abuse or talk about it. These are usually adult chronicles of their lives as a child. The types of abuse are almost anything you can imagine. Witnessing sexuality, fondling, sexual humiliation, voyeurism, rape, sexual exchange in order to survive, the roles or the experiences of the peoples, the child prostitutes that were held, especially the boys, in the camps, medical experiments, sexualized brutality, bestiality, and survival by using sexual humor. And I talk about these all in the book. Where child sex abuse occurred, again, almost everywhere, in homes, in ghettos, in labor camps, extermination camps, medical experiments, in hiding, done by the Einsatzgruppen and the soldiers, the Wehrmacht, among the Kindertransport children, children sent to safety across Europe's borders, and in the DP camps after the war. And children were abused sometimes as Jews or as while they were passing for Aryan. Perpetrators, German soldiers, Nazis, the fathers of children who were being hidden in homes, the siblings of children in the homes in which they were hiding, the friends of the hiding families, by farmers, by Allied soldiers in DP camps, by the Russian liberators, and by foster parents after the war, and occasionally by Jews. The characteristics of perpetrators, they were usually people in positions of authority where there was little fear of discovery or exposure. Children were usually vulnerable. They were alone, hidden in secret, no one to tell, no one to talk to, no one to appeal to for help. The hidden children were not blood relatives, so there was not that taboo against abusing them. Children were seen as the other. Children were viewed as the enemy. And sometimes children were abused as punishment for the Jewish crime of killing Christ. They deserved it. That's what their ancestors did to our Christ. We can do this to them. A few, very few, of the 160 child sex abuse reports I came across, only 2 or 3 reported Jewish rapists. One was Chaim Rumkowski in the Lodz ghetto, and there were 5 children that he was reported to have abused. Their stories are also quite revealing. Another was by a Jewish foreman, a 13-year-old, and another by a little boy of 5 who was hidden with his mother in a basement in Poland. Some children were abused as part of the medical experiments. One little girl said, "They forced one 14-year-old, and there were others, to penetrate me. I just cried like a kitten meowing. A child younger than me was raped by another child who was forced to do so by the guards." There are also reports of twins being forced to have sex with women and with other twins to see if they would also bear twins amongst Mengene's child prisoners. Some examples: Molly Weissenberg, Molly Applebaum, as she was known, was hidden with her older cousin Yellin underground. She was about 12 at the time, and she lived underground in a really a hole under the ground with her cousin for about 2 years. She was helped by a farmer, Victor Wojcik, and his sister, but they exchanged sex for survival. Their way of keeping him interested in them and willing to bring them food and help them and keep them hidden and not reveal them was by enticing them and to have sex with them. Another child, Susie Bechhofer, and her sister Lotta, were sent on the Kindertransport at the age of 3 to England, where they were sheltered by a reverend man and his wife Irene. Susie was sexually abused from the age of 9 years old, and she could not say anything or reveal it because her twin sister was sick, and she was afraid that if she complained or did anything, they wouldn't look after her sister. She was prevented having contact with any men or boys. She couldn't date until she eventually escaped and married secretly. She entered therapy in the late 1980s, where she then discovered that she was Jewish, and the reverend was never actually formally charged for what he had done. Children's experiences were denied. They were told it's best to forget and to move on. They were said, you were just a child. What could you know about such things? But they experienced horror, terror, vulnerability, and betrayal, distrust, painful childhood memories, and often wished that they were not alive. They experience what they called Holocaust denial, and many were both child survivors and the children of survivors. Child sex abuse, which is the title of another book of mine, and the Holocaust, because child sex abuse is a global occurrence. It occurs everywhere at every stage and every class of person across the globe. But the Holocaust created conditions that facilitated it. It was often for the children a double assault, both sexual abuse and betrayal by those who rescued them. But betrayal is Dante's lowest level of hell in his The Inferno. The Holocaust and child sex abuse are two of the most traumatizing experiences that children can endure. So in this situation, the real villains, particularly with regard to sexual behavior during the Nazi era, were Germans rather than the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bev. And I think it was a perfect closure for our other lectures. Now we have about almost half an hour for discussion and questions. Please, who would like to start? Or if you have any comments or remarks. So I would like to make one comment about shaving. Shaving heads of women was also a punishment for non-Jews, those who were officials in the camps, and if they were caught, for example, for trade in the black market with Jewish prisoners or something like that, one of the punishments was shaving the head. And they wanted to refer to the nakedness. I think that for women, especially in those times, I think today as well, but then I think especially, and especially in traditional and Orthodox communities, some of the women were not naked even in front of their husbands. So to be naked in front of a stranger was horrible. And then in most of the camps, the people who were in charge to shave the women were not women as we saw in the drawings that Batya presented, but mostly they were men. So it was another horrifying experience. And these are things that I wanted to add. And last but not least, Chaim Romkowski. Israel Aviram, who was a very interesting witness. He came very often to my students to give his story. He was in Lodz Ghetto and later on in Auschwitz. He used to recall Chaim Romkowski as a very dangerous persona. He used to enter to the factories where young women were working and no one dared to say no. He was always interested in the most beautiful, most fresh and young women, and no one dared to say no, because saying no was not only that you are going to dragged out of the ghetto, but also your whole family will be punished. So he was doing what he pleases, and I think that he was not alone. So these were some comments that I wanted to add to the things that were said here. Now, are there any other remarks, questions to the speakers, or just to add general information?
Laura Cohen wants, she raises her hand.
I don't see her hand, but please, Laura, go ahead.
I'd like to ask Dr. Chalmers, you mentioned a certain amount of testimonies. I believe it was, are you saying that you were referencing, I believe, 52,000 adult testimonies from adults and then a few hundred from children? Can you please clarify the numbers?
Okay, the 52,000, I don't remember referring to that, but those that reflects the number of testimonies that are in the Shoah Foundation. So if one searches through that, you come to a number. To the best of my knowledge, there are about 1,000 or so references in the Shoah Foundation that do mention some form of sexual abuse of adults across the board. Amongst the children, I came across not necessarily only in the Shoah Foundation, but references to only 160 children who report some kind, or where others have reported some kind of sexual abuse of those children. So it's very few. Some of them, the ones that are often reported in those testimonies, are of adults who refer back to when they were children. And then refer to them. But it's I found only 160 child sex abuse reports.
Okay.
But no,
Thank you.
it's not 52,000
Thank you,
reports
Bev.
of women. Could
I
I
would
add
like to...
one other thing about the whole issue of nudity, because this is really, you raised a very interesting point, Lily, that in the 1930s, we were much more restricted, restrained about sexuality. We cannot think of ourselves today where we are so open about sexuality in much of our worlds. And we cannot think that women in those days were the same. We were more modest, we dressed differently. It was very, very embarrassing to be exposed to have nudity of any kind. Even if you look at the depictions of medical examinations in those times, they were done through one's clothes. So you didn't get nude or naked in front of even your doctor. So you were quite right, Lily. This was a very much more shy time, but it hasn't changed in some ways. When I started to do the research, particularly on child sex abuse, I was met by the archivists, by many of the museums, by people saying, this is taboo, you can't write about this. And it was very, very difficult to access information and testimonies from archives and from libraries about sexual abuse. So the taboo hasn't altogether disappeared today.
Thank you, Bev. I saw a comment that I would like to say something about it. Why we are not dealing with the events of the 7th of October done by Hamas. It is a very important subject, but still we have to bear in mind that WHISC is dealing with women in the Holocaust and not genocide in general. If it will be asked by others, we can have one session just dealing with that topic, but it's not really our mandate. Our mandate is Holocaust. But again, if you are interested, we can have one of the coming sessions. We are going to have a panel every other month dedicated to these horrible events. Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Questions to our speakers?
Yoel wants to say something.
Yeah? I don't know why I don't see those eyes.
Unmute yourself, Yoel.
Okay. Do you hear me, Batya?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So I would like to make a comment and then a question. My comment regards what Lily just said, that shaving women's hair or heads was a punishment for non-Jewish prisoners as well. So it might be understood that non-Jews were not shaved when they came to the camp, but that's not the case.
No, just I have to stop you.
Yeah,
It's a misunderstanding. It's only non-Jews who had a role in the camp, like Blockälteste, etc., not prisoners in general. Generally, all the prisoners were shaved. But those who had a particular job, like Blokova, Blockälteste, Capo, etc., they were not shaved, and I was referring to them.
Okay,
So
when women came to the camp, they were not Blockälteste and were not Capos. The prominent jobs were given later. So basically, all women who came to the camp were shaved, except German prisoners. Now, regarding the punishment, both Jews, you must remember that the hair grows, right? Even in Auschwitz, and basically, women were not reshaved, except if there was a punishment. And for example, prisoners who were sent to the Strafkommando, to the punishment company, they were shaved again. And also women who were punished by the German overseers. So this is about shaving the heads. And for example, if you go to Auschwitz Museum into Block 6 and you look at the figures on the walls, these are mostly Polish women who came to the camp, and they're all shaved. And it's true that later on, the prominent prisoners were given better conditions, and they were not shaved, unless they were also could be punished by shaving. This also appears in the testimonies. So that was my comment. My question: it was mentioned that women received the striped uniform. And many people have seen many pictures with striped uniforms.
Not in all cases. Not in all cases. Not in all cases.
So my question is then, were Jewish prisoner women receiving striped uniforms as a regular process? So we know that Slovakian women who came to Auschwitz were given the uniforms of Red Army prisoners. And we know that Hungarian women, if we look at the album of Auschwitz album, they were just given dirty dresses. And many women witness, write in their testimonies or in the oral testimonies, they say that the clothing that they got was just thrown from a big pile of clothes that were collected on the ramp from women who went to the gas chamber. And even Nomi Yudkowsky, if you look at the drawings, I have one drawing here. I don't know if this will be clear, but in most of the drawings, the women do not have striped uniforms. So mostly prominent women, Jewish women, had striped uniforms, and non-Jewish women, many of them, most of them perhaps, had striped uniforms.
Thank you, Yoel, but I understand you are comment to my presentation. A striped uniform was as a symbol of not proper clothing to the women, sometimes oversized, sometimes worn out, sometimes dirty, but it was a symbol. You cannot squeeze in 15 minutes everything, but you are absolutely correct that not everywhere the women received a striped uniform.
Thank you.
I wanted to make another comment that the shaving was not only the head, the whole body.
I said that. Hani wants to ask a question.
Yes, Hani. I don't know. I don't see their hands. So, Batya, please. be in charge of.
I have a question to Mrs. Carol Rittner. Thank you very much. I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, and I was just wondering, I'm also all for confronting difficult information. But when difficult information also entails, sexual pictures, violence, whatever, when you say we have to confront this with our students, what age are you referring to? And how do you suggest you do this, that it become meaningful and not just what we call kitsch, where you'll never engage with it again? You'll see it, it'll have the wow factor, and it won't bring my pupils to any further curiosity or taking interest of the topic. Thank you.
Well, first of all, my experience has been in teaching about sexual violence to upper level undergraduates and graduate students. It's more than 50 years since I taught in high school. So, I do think we have to think about our audience, first of all, and what seems to be, if I could say, age appropriate. And, obviously, more mature students would be the ones I would deal with. And, how do you teach this in a way that it's not just, as you say, the wow factor? I think it has to do with the kinds of questions we try to ask ourselves and try to help students to ask. Now, I personally, many of the images that Batya used in her presentation, or the images that Bev used in her presentation, I really haven't used those even with undergraduate or graduate students. I would be, anyhow, I haven't used them extensively. I'm not saying I've never used them, but I haven't used them very extensively. But I think I love Myrna Goldenberg's comment that men and women suffered the same hell but different horrors. Even to say that, and then to try to get students to unpack that and say, well, what do you think that means? And then for me as the teacher, the instructor, to try to listen to what they haven't said and to perhaps raise other issues. There are probably people on our discussion this afternoon, this evening, who might be able to say much more about that. Bev, who has used very explicit images, maybe you could speak about how you teach about it, and so that it's not just a sort of passing, wow, that's something, but so what?
Carol, thank you. I can try. Let me clarify, I'm not a teacher in schools. I have also, like you, only taught at academic university student level, and not on the Holocaust, incidentally. That is the last 20 years of my research experience. Prior to that, it was primarily in terms of childbirth. But when I think about it, and I've often puzzled, how would I go about teaching this to younger children? And we now in Canada are instituting compulsory Holocaust education for grade 6, which is children about the age of 11, 12. And when I think about it, I would try to see what are the crucial areas for those children. They are at a point of going through puberty, just beginning. So issues like privacy are important for them. They don't want to be nude. They don't want to be seen naked anymore. They won't run around the house without clothes on anymore. The start of menstruation. And these are the issues I would pick up at that level and say, this is what happened to the women in the camps. What happened to menstruation? What happened to nudity in particular? How would you feel if you were forced to be naked in front of all these men or other women, or not to have clothes? What about your hair? They are particularly concerned about appearance at this point. And these are the issues I would start with them. And only in the later years, as they approach the end of their school years, where sex and sexuality and abuse and rape are things that we do teach children about more today, I would then raise those kinds of issues. But I think,
Bev, may I just ask a question, or perhaps make a comment? It seems to me that 11, I mean, you could deal with issues of privacy, etc., but are we talking about a single-sex class, or are we talking about mixed classes, boys and girls, or all? I mean, I personally, I think it's a very, very young age to deal with it, but perhaps there are people who have more experience than I in dealing with young students at that age. But I think it's a delicate issue, and you know, we have to deal with it sensitively. And
absolutely, we have to deal with it very sensitively.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we mustn't expose it, because children today are much more exposed and need to be exposed to sex and sex abuse. In my book on child sex abuse globally, it really is a major, major problem. And if we don't talk about it, children become much more vulnerable. They are much more able to resist and stronger when it comes to sexual abuse, when they know what it is and what grooming looks like and what internet use and abuse of sexuality looks like. So I think the time and the dates of saying this is too sensitive, this is too taboo for us to talk about are gone today. I think they really are. And this is very much the kind of reaction I got from when I started to do research on child sex abuse, both in the Holocaust and globally. Very much an attitude of our children are too young, we shouldn't expose them to this. They are exposed. If we just play on the Google for 5 minutes, we will come across the most horrific exposure of sexual abuse, which our children will explore whether we want them to or not. And if you forbid them access to Google, they'll find it from their friend next door. So I really, really do think we need to get over our hesitations and concerns and taboos about talking about sexuality and start using the Google and the internet to teach children how to be aware and knowledgeable so that they can recognize it when it's starting to happen to them.
But Bev, I agree with you, but I think you're going off on a tangent that is very important, but I'm not sure that it's central to teaching about sexual abuse and sexuality and sexual violence during the Holocaust. And I'd be interested, honey, in knowing from you, from your very question that you asked, what you think is the appropriate way to deal with this.
Well, first of all, I would say that I'm a high school teacher, so I teach 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, and that's why the answer of graduate and undergraduate students, I said, oh, phew, because that made me very nervous. I think between Carol and Bev, I think that's where lies the answer. I think. I mean, we wouldn't speak about dogs mounting women. No, this is something that
don't have to be so horrific.
But certainly that place where shame. I think shame is the issue, and other than that, I still have to think about it and digest it. But it certainly has been a flourishing conversation. I thank you both.
I'd like to add something else. I'd like to add something else. We have to take into consideration the culture environment and the place that we teach the topic of the Holocaust. There is a huge difference between countries, especially between Israel and other countries, how to teach children the Holocaust. In Israel, the Holocaust is one of the pillar of our culture, if we want or we it doesn't want to. In other places, sometimes just the word Holocaust needs to be explained. They know nothing about the event. So jumping into sexual violence during the Holocaust is too far. Yeah. So, and also I think that I wouldn't teach young students, even not 11 or 12 years old, this topic, or even though they are exposed, as Bev said, to other sexual violence.
I agree, but it's not an introduction. It's not the first thing you talk about. It's the last thing you talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
let me just add a
Well,
little story.
the other thing that I would like to also say that sexual violence, as I tried to say in my few comments, is only one of the ways that women suffered.
Yes.
And I don't think we should privilege it, so to speak, particularly with even high school students. Not that we shouldn't mention it or whatever, but I mean, when I've taught about this, I've taught about it in the context of a course that's like either women during genocide. So I've talked about other genocides as well, Rwanda, Congo, former Yugoslavia, or women during the Holocaust. So that it's I've never taught a course on just sexual violence during the Holocaust, so to speak.
And you wouldn't, yeah. You wouldn't.
It's always a part of. It's always a part of. Yes.
Can I add one little story, which I always find interesting when people ask these kinds of questions. And it's the story of my own daughter, who at about the age of 9 or 10, we were staying in another person's house, and they had many books on the Holocaust, which I was not reading at the time. She picked up a book early, and in the story, it tells the story of a 9-year-old girl who watched her own parents be killed in front of her eyes. And my daughter read this book, and the first week or so, first few pages of the book tells the story, and she put the book down and never picked it up again. And a week later, she said, she went back and started to read the book. And years later, I said to her, what happened? What made you change your mind and make it that you wanted to go back and finish the story? She said, well, she realized that that little girl was the same age as she was. And if that little girl had been brave enough to experience those horrific things in her own world and family, then she, as my daughter, had to be brave enough to read about it. If that little girl had been strong enough to live through it and write her story, my daughter should be brave enough to read her story in her honor. And I think that's one of the attitudes that maybe we can explain to children, that these are things that happened to others, and they were brave enough to live through it and write about it, and perhaps they can gain some strength for themselves by honoring those children or those families. It's a thought, and perhaps that is one way of broaching the subject for younger students.
Thank you, Bev, very much. I think that we must end our meeting. Time is running away. We have 2 minutes left. And I'm looking at the number of participants that is dropping. It reminds me the poem of Bialik, who is writing אחד אחד ובאין רואה, one by one without being seen. But here it is אחד אחד ויש רואה, one by one, but we see it on the screen. So I'm afraid that we have to conclude. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for our great speakers. It was really challenging, inspiring, and I think that some of us won't sleep that good tonight. Thank you very much, Professor Carol Rittner. Thank you very much, Dr. Brutin, and also Dr. Beverley Chalmers. I hope to see you all in 2 months in another panel. Be safe and goodbye. Thank you.